Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today you're going to get a brief but not thorough or academic history lesson. So take this with a pinch of salt, but understand I studied this in college. I don't know the dates, but I do know the gists. Alright? Second, you're going to get a thorough, yes, this is going to be an hour-long video, most likely, discussion on has the internet and the rise of self-publishing, YouTube, podcasts, Amazon, Kindle publishing, whatever, Etsy, etc. Has the internet cheapened, lessened, or destroyed arts and literature? Now, I'm lumping them together, arts and literature, because, this is going to be a broad video, but I'm going to try to focus on a few points. So we have to go all the way back to when humans were not humans, when we were just hominids, ape-like primates that were becoming humans. We used, or our ancient ancestors used primitive tools to make cave paintings. Now, some will argue this is the beginning of art. Others will try to argue this is the earliest, most primitive examples we have of the beginnings of what would become language. It doesn't matter. What we can definitively say is humans were telling stories using tools and resources at their disposal pretty much as soon as we were self-aware. So, going back hundreds of thousands of years. But, yeah, that's like animals becoming humans trying to figure things out. Does that count? Well, I'll say yeah, if you were a cave person a million years ago, you probably wanted to wander around and look at the other cave paintings that your tribal brothers and sisters and cousins and whatnot did, because it would inspire you and then you would learn from it. I don't know. I wasn't alive back then. But we go forward a little bit, and I'm not going to get into the who did what, when, and where. But we do know paper was invented at some point. Started off early with tree bark and papyrus or whatever it's called, and then later evolved into what we now know as paper. Scrolls were the earliest forms, tablets, some things were carved in stone, but we developed language, written, spoken, and, observable, sign language or something of that sort. And so we began cataloging what we knew, keeping diaries, pseudo-reporting on the news, writing literature, writing fiction, writing non-fiction, instructional books, and religious texts. These would develop over time, but they had to be chiseled or later handwritten or carved or burned. By hand, copied one at a time from one physical to another physical. A laborious process that, probably did help with the development of our brains, and probably did help with the development of education and our understanding of philosophy and religion and science and society and politics and business and commerce, etc. So, over time, humans began writing some really deep philosophical, really rich religious texts, and a lot of very inspirational, fantastical fairy tales and epic poems and fiction and all these fantastical stories and amazing literature. A lot of it destroyed, but we're going to skip over that. Not important for this video. But it took thousands of years before we got the printing press. Now, here is where we have a split. Proto-humans, if you could stick your hand in the mud or the clay or the paint and smack it on a cave, you were an artist or a writer or a storyteller or whatever. Anybody and everybody that was a human or proto-human had access to arts and literature. This was the norm until the printing press. Because, here we go, if you were a monk or a 13-year-old student or a prince or a princess somewhere in a foreign land, or you were a traveling merchant, or you were just a bum wandering around, or you were a priest, it didn't matter. If you lived on Earth during the pre-printing press days, you could go out and cut tree bark off of a tree and scribble on it or burn on it or write. Ink was accessible. You could go out in the wilderness and gather your own ink. No one could stop you. No one could stop you even today from making your own paper. But once the printing press came on the scene, we had a revolution. But it was a double-edged sword. The first side of the sword was a revolution in mass media was invented for the first time. This meant that you could print anything you wanted on a printing press and then duplicate it and make copies relatively quickly, but still rather expensive compared to the other methods. Not as labor intensive, so you could save money. You'd spend a little bit of money up front to get the printing press and then save money on labor costs because it was easier to operate a printer than it was to sit down and write by hand. So I'm going to change the orientation of the camera because I'm going to lay back. So, here we are. But the printing press, the ink, the paper, the skilled laborer to operate it, the writer, the typewriter, the editor, these are not cheap. These are expensive, very expensive propositions, especially in the brand new days when this machine is patented and protected by patent laws. So yeah, alright. So, this was the first introduction of mass media. The second side of that sword, remember I said it was a double-edged sword? The other edge meant that the people with the money to own a printing press could control the media. And this is where the concept of mass media, corporatized private industry came from. This was before capitalism, back in the feudal mercantile days, but still, what it did was it allowed certain people, i.e. rich people, relative to the time, to control the media. They could print whatever they wanted, and the masses would just buy whatever the rich people printed because that was it. You had no other options. You could still technically buy a typewriter whenever that got invented, or buy paper and ink and make your own copies yourself, but it was per copy for a single individual way more cost prohibitive. I'm going to make up numbers just to illustrate. These are not real numbers, but to give you just an illustration. When the printing press came out, we're going to adjust for inflation, and we're just going to use made up numbers, okay? Don't come at me, historians. Let's say Gutenberg made a book. He made a copy of Homer's The Odyssey. Printed, 100,000 copies and put it in bookstores all across the land. He could sell, profit margin, etc. Again, we're adjusting for inflation and making up numbers here. He could sell his copy of Homer for about $5 that would more or less be today's money, but whatever $5 is today, reverse engineer it backwards. You know what I'm saying? But basically he could just print books all day long, and it wouldn't cost him all that much because he already had the printing press. He already had the machinery and the tools. So yeah, all right. But if you sat down and wrote your own copy of Homer, because it was copyright was expired by this point, you just or Canterbury Tales or whatever, and you copied it line by line by hand. First of all, you would have to buy a lot of sheets of paper, pens, quills, ink, etc. And it would take you hundreds of hours to copy it, staple it together, glue it, put some kind of fancy cover on it. And you had one copy that you could sell for the equivalent of, say, if Gutenberg's copy of Homer was $5, you would have to sell your handmade copy for about $100. No one was going to pay for that. Obviously, these are made-up numbers, and I'm very much exaggerating, but that kind of illustrates the point that once the mass media came on the scene, the independent publisher, artist, author, etc., well, they fell by the wayside. There were hobbyists and artisans, and there were still small-time indie publishers that would find ways to get their publications out there. Over time, the guys with the printing press, the businesses, would print their products, but hey, they still had additional hours in the day the press wasn't operating. They would, sell that space to somebody else who would purchase, who would say, I'll hire you to print me 1 million copies of X. And they'll be like, all right, here you go. And so they can make money that way. The point is, only the rich people could control the media. They could own newspapers, book publishers, dictionaries, etc. And it was this way for a few hundred years. Yes, hundreds of years. Like 300 or 400 years it was this way. And then we get into the 18th century. We don't have a lot of changes, but we do have now mechanical typewriters, and we've got more advanced printing presses and paper and ink and etc. But we've moved away from, and I didn't even touch on this, but I'll throw it out there, artist guilds. We kind of moved away from that into the more independent artist would, just make hand copies of their work and sell it at like museums and art houses and to rich people, galleries, etc. Okay. But we get into the 19th century, and for like the largest chunk of it, nothing changes other than the United States happens, the French Revolution happens, a few other political upheavals and things, but let's just focus on technology. All right. The United States is unique because they wrote in a small line at the very beginning of the Bill of Rights that says something of the freedom of the press shall not be abridged or whatever. Basically, freedom of the press. The press isn't defined, but we're not going to get into that. Not in this video. But here's where we're going to go. Newspapers became more common and easier to access in the U.S. because, the cost of the printing press came down, but still you had to be middle class to get one, not necessarily wealthy. And there was still labor costs and printing and distribution costs, but things were advancing rapidly. By the middle of the 19th century, they introduced photography and telegraphy. Telegraphy allowed news to be transmitted via a wire much faster. And with the introduction of photography, you could now add photos to your publications, making them more interesting and compelling. But still, average Joe couldn't afford a printing press. Maybe they could afford a typewriter and a stack of paper and some ink. They probably couldn't afford the shipping costs, so they would have to deliver their manuscripts themselves once they were completed. They could maybe self-publish like a newsletter, maybe. But, full books, novels, memoirs, dictionaries, how-to books, cookbooks, etc. This was beyond the reach of the average nobody. They could scrape together the money they've got a manuscript, and then, lease, like I said, the space from the printers and then just do it themselves, but they still had to pay for shipping costs. It was still a pretty expensive proposition. Not as expensive as building your own print shop and buying your own equipment and hiring press operators, but hey, it was less expensive, but still expensive. So, at the tail end, the very end of the 19th century, photography moves into motion pictures and filmography. Now we have films, we have movies, we have cinema. This introduced, again, a new technology that was cost prohibitive for the average Joe, and setting up a production house, setting up a stage, setting up a production studio, and hiring actors and directors and producers and stagehands and etc. and camera operators and video editors and blah 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 blah. Yeah, you weren't going to be able to do that unless you got money from a bank or an investor or a wealthy uncle or whoever. So, film became the purview of the rich. Only rich people could make films. Yeah, there were some independent films. Some people would scrape together the money to get used or less expensive, less feature-rich cameras and go make, I will say, independent films of various qualities on extremely low to no budgets with friends and family and enthusiastic individuals. That continued all the way through the 20th century. Kevin Smith's Clerks is an example of this. Low-budget movie made on a very inexpensive camera, relying heavily on cast and crew members that are friends and family and colleagues. People didn't have to pay that much. But those examples were still pretty rare, and there were still no guarantees. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, telegraphy evolved into wireless telegraphy, which was radio, and then radio merged with film or video signals, we'll say video type, and introduced television, which would broadcast a video signal over the airwaves that people could get. But again, you still had to be rich if you wanted to buy a studio and cameras and a tower and a radar transmitter and a microwave emitter and a radar dish and all this fancy. Yes, a transmitter and a dish are not the same thing. Fuck off. Receiver, transmitter, they're different. Anyways, you had to buy hella expensive equipment, very expensive power bill. You had to pay your, professional staff. No, it was cost prohibitive. Again, yeah, there were people making home videos, home movies. Those were like 8mm cameras that they were just filming silent, black and white clips, 2 or 3 minutes at a time. Not really, what we have today. And definitely not what they had back then in terms of cinema and television. Now, I had to sit up because I had to blow my nose, which is why I paused the video, but you might not have noticed. I don't know. But anyways, we're back. Okay. Now, the point I'm trying to make is there was this concept within society and the media of professional media. You had to do things a certain way. Well, you had to if you wanted to get funding to buy the equipment and pay for the people, etc. So, I apologize, but you know what? I'm stuffy and I got medical conditions. I'm not going to apologize. I'm doing my best. Please forgive me, but also, cut me some slack. Alright. But the thing is, it was still expensive. So again, for about 100 years of the 20th century, almost the entire decade. I mean, not decade, century. Decade of decades, or however you phrase it. Anyways, for about 100 years again, you still had rich people controlling the media. Again, you could have some independent authors and publishers and artists and photographers, but it was still expensive relative to, the olden days when you could just go cut down a tree and then you had unlimited bark, paper, etc. And still relatively expensive compared to what we have today. This is an entire film studio in the palm of your hand. Audio editing, video editing, special effects, camera, photography, it's all in one little itty bitty piece of plastic. Alright, so yeah, we've come a long fucking way. But let's backtrack. Let's start way back at the beginning. I'm going to fast forward, but if you had to go out, you're caveman, cavewoman, go out into the wilderness and locate clay and dandelions and roses and turnips, tulips, I don't know my flowers, and grind them into, paint, and grab a stick and swap it around and make your painting or whatever, you were going to appreciate that more as the artist, the creator of that work, because you actually had to physically gather the materials and invest your time and what would be the equivalent of money, your resources, into doing that. If you were taking the time to gather, paint materials and taking the time to do a cave painting, you were taking away time from hunting and gathering and coming up with food, or mating with your partner to make babies, or raising the babies, or fighting predators, or whatever. Which pretty much meant it was kind of an expensive proposition. You were trading this for that. Okay, I'm giving up more food to have this expression of myself. It meant more to you, I would assume. It would if it were me. And then we get into the paper days, and I'm gonna lump it all together. Stone tablets, bark, scrolls, books, whatever. Once we get into paper, if you just want to sit down and write a book, that's not that expensive, but who's going to read it? Well, it was access, right? Well, you would write it, and then make a copy, and then hand a copy to your let's say your family, right? Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, brother, sister, cousin, uncle, aunt, babies, kids, hey, everybody make copies. You could do it, but again, everybody that's taking time to, gather the resources, again, and then taking the time to make the copies, and then taking the time to go to the market, or take them to the library, or the church, or the university, or the schoolhouse, or wherever you were distributing the books, still was taking away time you would be using to do other things like farming and hunting and gathering and making babies. So it was still a kind of expensive proposition, but, doable. But again, it was personal, right? But a lot of those works, we don't hold them in high regard. I mean, the vast majority of works from that time period, diaries, genealogies, maybe historical accounts, maybe somebody kept a record of, royal decrees or whatever. So there's some anthropological significance to the vast majority of it. but only a small, insignificant chunk, proportionally, has any value in science, religion, philosophy, politics, or history. Most of it's useless. You could read about, random European 327,889's Joseph Smith diary, but all you're going to learn is he was whacking it to, pictures of Mother Mary at the Mother Mary statue at the temple, or I hunted a deer today, or you're not going to learn anything. It has no value. It's just like, here's my random thoughts, right? Well, that's what I'm asking. Does it have any value outside of here's some person's diary? Well, maybe they wrote about what the mayor said that day, or the king, or the traveling circus, or the priest, or there were some marauders, or whatever. Or they just opined and wrote about here's what I think, philosophy, religion, whatever. Or they wrote down recipes or instructions on how to do things. So yeah, there is some intrinsic value, but is there cultural value? Is it significant beyond the local isolated few who would have an interest in that region, that family, that person, or that time period? Well, again, at that time, no. Billy Bob Joseph Smith, nobody else read his diary until maybe after he died, and even then it would have been a historian 500 years later. So, no. Outside of his writing down his private personal thoughts, nobody read that. A cookbook, you might have shared your cookbook with your local church community, but no, the vast majority of grandmas that wrote cookbooks, that was grandma's cookbook. She would give it to her daughter, and her daughter, and her daughter, and her daughter, down the family tree. They weren't selling it at the local market, or sharing it at the local church, or Amazon, or Walmart, or whatever. No, they kept that to themselves. People still do that today. Cooking blogs, what do? Share recipes. You see the parallel, the analog? Like I said, it's going to be a long video. Please bear with me. There's some meat and potatoes in here, and there might be some juicy T-bone at the end. Steak or bone, I don't know. You'll find out. But, alright. So, culturally speaking, the diaries of the day, which would be blogs or vlogs today, or maybe even newsletters back in the day, not that useful to us, outside of this is how somebody in that time period would have spoke, written, spelled, and maybe thought. Alright, well, we can learn from that, but, alright. You're not going to go back and read it for entertainment, or, you're not going to reread it like you would a Star Wars or To Kill a Mockingbird. Although if you're rereading To Kill a Mockingbird, you got a tough heart, because that book makes me bawl like a baby all 3 times I read it. I'll read it again, but not anytime soon. That book hits me in the feels. But it's okay, I'll reread it. But here's the thing. We did have fairy tales, literature. We did have epic poems and regular poems and songs and music and things like that were shared. Not in the mass market level, but within the local community or city-state or state or county or country or empire or whatever. Probably not worldwide. Probably not translated into other languages back then. Maybe modern linguists would do that. Today, historians or, somebody trying to make a quick buck off of public domain works, but, there were still what would be later classified as science fiction stories or fantasy or, adventure stories and swashbuckling and all this stuff. romance novels, etc. These things did exist, but on a smaller scale. So, my question here is, if you're in 10,000 BC and you wrote an exaggerated mythological level of, well, we went on a hunting camping trip over the weekend and we killed a bear, but you're going to change it to, we went on a quest through the woods, through the river, up the mountain to fight a dragon. Alright, well, you're exaggerating as fuck, but entertaining. But who's going to read it? We have to go back to who's the audience, right? If there's no mass market access, then there's no mass market cultural interconnectedness. There's no cultural zeitgeist. So, yeah, people, maybe, Joe Schmo wrote 100 fantasy novels about slaying dragons and alligators and, horny lizard men, and I mean horny with horns on their heads, not, you know what I mean. Anyways, but if those books were buried in his tomb or grave, or burned, or disappeared, or not preserved, who fucking cares, right? But even when he was alive, he wrote those books, those stories, whatever. Maybe he shared them with his best friend or a partner. Maybe. But what if he didn't? What if they were just for him and he read them to himself? Alright, weird, but people do it, right? Okay. Would that be more meaningful than once we get to mass media, right? There's no cultural zeitgeist. Nobody else outside of his circle knows about these stories, so they don't enter the lexicon, right? There's no mass meta cultural understanding of pop culture, right? There's no pop culture. It's just, alright, he wrote a book, and his neighbor wrote a book, and his neighbor wrote a book, and so on and so forth. Maybe they made a few copies, like I said, to share with the church or the local men's club or the Masons or whatever, but most likely not, right? Now, once we get into, fast forward into the mass media era, printing press, photography, newspapers, film, telegraphy, radio, television, we get into the, what would become the multimedia mass market pop cultural zeitgeist. Now there are famous paintings because everybody's seen a photograph of them. There are famous photographs because everybody's seen a newspaper clipping of them. There are famous newspaper headlines because everybody's seen the microfiche. There are famous films that everybody has seen, famous television episodes that everybody has seen. Even if they haven't seen the specific item in question, they've seen it replicated or duplicated or recreated or parodied or referenced somewhere else. So they're still tangentially aware of it, if not fully consciously aware of its full significance. Right? Everybody knows Gone with the Wind, even if they've never seen it. They have a very brief, surface level understanding of essentially what it is, right? A Civil War musical in the South. Alright, okay, I can fill in the blanks in my brain. But, alright, so, now we have to go back to what makes something culturally significant. Does it have to have an impact on pop culture or the cultural zeitgeist? Specifically meaning, does it have to penetrate the majority of the people in a society and alter the way they operate? Meaning, it influences the way they think or speak, or they reference it or write about it or talk about it or replicate it or spoof it or whatever. So yeah, I would say a piece of work that enters into the cultural zeitgeist, the pop culture lexicon, the canon, if you will. that will be considered, by my loosey-goosey definition I'm going with, which I haven't really given a dictionary definition, but I'll do my best. If a work of art or literature has a significant cultural impact on the broader pop culture during its time, and at least a residual impact outside its time on the broader culture, I would classify that as a culturally significant piece of art or literature. The Library of Congress of the United States of America generally uses this type of logic when determining what goes into the Library of Congress archive. Now, a lot of books, photographs, newspapers, films, movies, episodes of television shows, radio broadcasts, records, cassettes, tapes, CDs, etc., 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 have been lost to time, destroyed, not preserved, no longer exist. Those most likely had no, actual impact on pop culture. They were fleeting for a brief period of time, disappeared, and now they're just remnants that somebody allegedly remembers may have happened at some point in time. Or we have residual references to it. A movie poster, somebody talking about it in their diary, etc. Now, I didn't even talk about magazines. I've done a video on magazines, but briefly, they're just newspapers that are fancy, that don't do news. That's the best way to explain it. But they're usually specialized. Now, magazines, we have a modern equivalent. Websites. We have vlogs, blogs, podcasts, etc. Podcasts would be the modern equivalent of a FM, AM radio broadcast. YouTube gets its name from tube television. The tube, your CRT television, cathode ray tube, comes from television. But also kinda is a loosey-goosey kinda pseudo-substitute for films. You can find films on YouTube, but the vast majority of YouTube content is inspired by or in some way mimics standard, traditional, professional broadcast television, whether it's broadcast over the airwaves or transmitted over a cable system or streamed over the internet via Netflix. It's still television. YouTube does not produce content. Well, they kind of sort of do, but within partnership of creators. But, okay, 1950. I went to college. I'm making this up. Went to college, studied arts and literature, communication, journalism, whatever the equivalent degree would be or was at the time. And I decided I want to start a television broadcast. I have basically two options. Option A, go to the local TV stations and pitch my idea to them. Hey, I would like to do this. Can I have the airtime? And will you give me a budget so I can do it and let me use your equipment? Maybe I come with a sponsor to sweeten the deal, but that's pretty much how it would go. The alternative would be go to public access and then just, say, hey, can I use your equipment? Here's what I want to do. They won't give you money, but they'll be like, hey, yeah, if you want it, do it, and then we'll put it on the air. But I would still have to write a script and a proposal and a pitch and a presentation to pitch to people, which is time consuming. I'd still have to get a sponsor or an investor or borrow or sell stuff or whatever to acquire the funds to buy the necessary equipment, camera, lights, microphone, etc. And then I would still have to go into the studio, set up the equipment, the lights, the staging, the blocking, etc., etc., etc. Film the damn thing, and either broadcast it live or film it, tape it, whatever, and have them retransmit it whenever, however, I don't know, whatever. I know how it works, but we're not going to get into it. I used to be a master control operator at a TV station. I know this shit, okay? So, let's move on. Now, today, I don't even have to graduate college or even high school. I just wake up one day and decide I want to make a YouTube channel. Well, I already own a cell phone, so I'm good to go. I download the YouTube app, I hit record, I record my video, I hit save, upload, fill in the boxes and check mark the boxes, and then about 5 to 10 minutes later, bam, I'm now presenting a television broadcast over the internet. Now, it's no budget. I'm using my cell phone, or I'm just using this as an analogy, not me specifically. Using a cell phone to shoot and edit and cobble it all together. And then, you know, it all pieces together. But, you know, that's like this channel. Very low effort, very low to no budget, very little work requirement. And now I have to catch my breath because I just realized that we asked somebody not to do something. But anyways, I'm falling asleep. I apologize. I don't even know what my train of thought was. Anyways, what was I saying? Television, YouTube. Okay. So yeah, low effort, right? Now some YouTubers will buy Ring cameras and, you know, omnidirectional, unidirectional microphones, lapel mics, and teleprompters, and set up a desk and a blue screen and make it into a production. They'll maybe have a friend or a partner or colleague or family member or brother, sister help them out. But it's usually, they'll put in a little more effort, but you're just getting them talking about whatever it is with a better looking picture, I guess, and a better looking background environment, I guess. Now is where I gotta take a sip of my Rockstar because I am falling asleep. Kids, do not smoke. Commentators down below, don't ask me when I smoke, please. It's legal. It's tobacco, okay? God damn it. But I'm not going to get into the details. Now, alright. So we got YouTube. Now let's go back to radio. I did study broadcasting in college. I had a radio show. I don't talk about it. It was not good. But I've had podcasts. I also had fake radio shows that I did on my cassette recorders back when I was a kid. And mixtapes and playlists. And I used to be a DJ, and I would DJ school dances, and then bars and clubs and parties, and then weddings, and then made a living, and then got into television, etc., in the news media business. So I know my stuff. Let's go back to 1940. I want to open a radio station, or just have a 1-hour radio show. Well, my options are not great. I could go to the local AM, or there's no FM yet, so the local radio station, and ask them, can I have an hour of time to do a radio show, a talk show? And they're going to say no, or they're going to say, come back with a sponsor and buy the time and I'll sell it to you, just like the TV station would. It was less expensive than television, but still cost prohibitive for the average Joe. College graduate with no income you're not going to have the money to, buy the airtime. So you're going to have a really good sales pitch when you go around town to furniture stores and car dealerships and hotels and say, hey, give me money so I can go make a radio show. They're going to give you one of these, but in the polite business version of a no thanks, but thanks. There's the door. Hit the road. Or you get lucky and you gather a sponsor that'll be like, all right, I'll pay the airwaves. Let me run the commercials during the time slot. And there you go. Now, it would have cost, I'm making up numbers here, but let's say if you wanted to buy the television airwaves, let's say it would have cost you $100,000 for a 60-minute block of airtime. That's an exaggeration, but let's just, we're using numbers. 1950s dollars. That's probably hella inflated, but let's just use it as an illustration. The radio equivalent, same time, probably would have cost you $3,000, maybe $4,000 for that hour of airtime. If you wanted the entire hour, maybe. Now today, the numbers are probably all over the place because local radio and TV stations, you know what? They don't got the reach and the money and the big bank accounts they used to have. So they're definitely more willing to say, you know what? You want to buy an hour of airtime? Here you go. Give us like $800. We'll give you an hour at 2 in the morning. Yeah, alright, fuck it, whatever, I'll do my show. But, let's say you want to create your own radio station. Well, that, my friend, is almost, yes, almost as expensive as a television station. Because you still got to have a building, you still got to have a soundproof studio, you still got to have microphones, you don't have to have cameras, so you save money there. You don't have to have a video editor, so you save a little money there. You don't have to have the hot lights and the sticks on the gaffers and the et ceteras. So you save a little money there, but you still got to have a record player and later a cassette, 8-track, CD player, etc. You still got to have a subscription from ASAP and BMI and BMG and Sony and everybody else to play records over the air, or you're going to get your ass sued out of business. You still got to have the money to come up with a studio. Not as big of a studio necessary for radio as for television, but you do want a big enough studio to bring live bands in from time to time. So it's still got to be big enough. So it's still not cheap. Then you got to buy either a tower or space on a tower, which means you got to buy the airwaves from the FCC. Now, that is not cheap, and the FCC has to give you permission to broadcast at that specific frequency on that specific transponder. And so you pay the FCC fees and you set up the license and you buy the transponder or rent one, lease one, whatever. So at this stage, you've basically built a TV station without a video camera. That's it. It's the same, more or less, number of, back in the day, number of people to operate a radio station as a TV station, because you still got to have a sales rep, you still got to have a station manager and a program manager and a radio DJ and a traffic controller. Not air traffic, but traffic is it. Whatever. Just Google it, okay? Radio traffic. Just Google it. I can't explain it. It's complicated. They're the person that makes sure everything is on air when it's supposed to be, where it's supposed to be. All right. So you're only saving really money on the video cameras and not having to pay a video editor and make, a producer, but you still gotta have a producer for a radio show. So you're not saving that much money. If it costs $1 million to open a TV station, it costs $850,000 to open a radio station. You know what I mean? You're not saving that much money going into radio. Plus, you still have to pay for those subscriptions that the TV doesn't. Now, TV is different because they do have subscriptions, but they have wire services that they subscribe to, but they're also affiliated with a network, so they get programming through the network, so they kind of save money that way too. Now, radio networks did exist, but most of your radio stations, AM or FM, back then, today it's a little different. They're not really networks, but it's different. It's like a network, but it's more like syndicated today than anything. But, alright, here we go. Still expensive, right? Today, if I want to start a podcast, I can do it for free. I go to Spotify for podcasters. I create a free account. Presumably, I already have Spotify anyways. Either the ad-supported free rubbish version, or I pay the $12, $13 a month for it. You should. Everybody should have Spotify. Not a sponsor, but you should, theoretically. In addition to even if you have the other streaming services. But that's not the topic of this video. But I just hit record. Hey everybody, welcome to my show, blah, 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 blah. Pause. Title, description, upload. An hour, 2 hours later, I've got a radio broadcast over the internet. But here's the difference, right? We got to go back in time again. I'm sorry, but we have to. We don't really have an ancient times one-to-one analog of radio, but you did have sporting events or competitive athletic events, wrestling matches, in the Greco-Roman era. You had the stadiums, you had plays, stage plays, etc. You would still have somebody in a booth somewhere with like a bullhorn or some type of device that would help project their voice, commentating and announcing and telling people what's going on. That's the closest equivalent we have to a radio broadcaster at the time. So, most likely you have someone doing a live show. There is no physical media representation of it. It goes to the audience, the few thousand people in the audience at the time. That's it. That's your audience. It has no reach beyond that. There might be a written account that it occurred, and maybe a paper transcript, maybe, but not likely. And that's it. We have no hard physical evidence that this occurred, but we know it did based on the ancillary, observable anthropological evidence that we have. I'm not an anthropologist, but my sister is. She has a master's degree, so I trust her. But I did take a class. One class, 200 level, I think, maybe 300 level, of anthropology in college. So I have a little bit more than a surface bare bones level, but not much more understanding of how anthropology operates and works and functions. But that's neither here nor there. I just want to point that out just so you know that I'm not just pulling shit out of thin air. But I am kind of. Which is what anthropologists do. They look at something and they make up a story, and then other anthropologists look at it and they say, actually, I think this. There's not always agreement, but we do have enough evidence that somebody probably announced the gladiators and told people what was happening and don't forget your concessions, etc. Somebody probably did that. So that goes back to again, it would have been a very local audience. It wouldn't have been that culturally significant outside of, hey, Odysseus is going to die today because he's fighting Golobulus, and Golobulus is 450 pounds of muscle, and Odysseus is a scrawny little, 95 pounds of skin and bones and he's going to die because he's the slave or prisoner or whatever that we're killing. And that's all. That's it. The local audience would have remembered Odysseus' name for a day, and they would have forgotten it because there were 12 other prisoners that were going to get killed that day. They weren't recorded or remembered, right? So no cultural significance to reference in future works. Now, radio broadcasts, a lot of them were lost to time because they were just broadcast. Some of them kept archives. They recorded on tape or wax or whatever they had access to at the time. Some people, listeners who had radio receivers, radio sets, who were picking up the broadcast and listening to it at home, were recording some of this stuff so that they would have an archive for future, or just a copy for future reference to play it back, or maybe an archive. Museums and city governments and libraries, etc., would have done some of this as well. But you know what I forgot to mention during the radio era that does still exist and does still operate? Ham radio, shortwave radio. That is a more likely analog to the podcast today than broadcast radio. I say more likely because, you could sit there in your basement or closet or garage or wherever with your ham radio and do your radio show over the airwaves, and anyone in the world could tune in if they wanted, and then you would just tell them, hey, I'll be back next Thursday at this same time. And they would just mark it on their calendar and come back the next Thursday or whatever. These may or may not have been recorded, but they were only received by a very small number of enthusiasts at best. So they would have had no impact on the cultural lexicon, right? They would have had a small, insignificant, but enthusiastic, loyal audience, and that's it. Again, we know this occurred because we have actual photographic, filmographic, film, television. We have tangible, verifiable evidence this took place because we can observe it with the technology of the time, preserved with the technology we have today. But, again, this is personal, right? I am, let's say, Joe Bob. Not me, not you, not the Joe Bob. But I'm sitting in my basement, Joe Bob, or Joel, Joel, Ginny, whatever. Just pick a person, pick a name, is sitting in their basement, or wherever, and they're doing their little talk show for 1 hour a week. Hey, Harry Truman dropped a bomb on Japan. We need to talk about this. And then they talk about it. Or, hey, Dickie Nixon is a piece of scumbag, so we need to talk about this. Or, I don't know if I have an opinion on Vietnam, but maybe let's talk about this. Or, hey, I watched the Yankees get their ass whooped last night. Let's talk about this. Whatever. People would talk about whatever the fuck they wanted. Sometimes it would just be rambling. Yeah, I went fishing today, and I got a couple of rainbow trout, and I skinned them, and I ate some, and they was good, and I had some potatoes, but no gravy, just ketchup. Whatever, that would be their show. Whatever. Same thing we have today with YouTube and podcasts and blogs. But I promise I'm making a point, right? I'm laying the foundation, the groundwork. There's meat and potatoes here, right? But we're getting to the T-bone. And we're going to ask the question again. Has the internet and the rise of self-publishing cheapened or lessened art and literature? So, now we're caught up. Today we've got websites and blogs and forums and podcasts and YouTube and Spotify and GarageBand and everything else. It doesn't matter what content you want to create. Music, skateboarding videos, talk shows, whatever. Podcast, radio, sports talk. It doesn't matter what you want to create. Today, the tools are negligibly inexpensive. Like, you probably already have them suitable starter kits in your home. and then you just upgrade as you go. But most likely, if you're watching this video, you have a smart TV or a PlayStation or a laptop or a Switch or a smartphone. I'm gonna bet money, not literal money, but this is a turn of phrase, an expression. I'm willing to bet money you probably 100% have a smartphone in your house, if not you yourself. Or you can very easily get access to one. Very easily. Same with a laptop or a Chromebook. So, if you were motivated or inclined to start a YouTube channel or a podcast or just do photography or draw, doodle art, whatever, you already possess the basic tools, which are still significantly more advanced than what the professionals had 50 years ago and what primitives had thousands of years ago. Alright? But we have to talk about reach, audience, impact, significance. Reach. Now, theoretically, a podcast or a YouTube video or a TikTok or whatever has infinite reach. Because theoretically, every device that's connected to the internet that can access that file through whatever means, torrents or directly through the podcast app or RSS feed or YouTube or whatever, app, website, whatever, theoretically every device that has access to that file should be able to play it back on the entire planet, which should be a statistically extremely significant chunk of the human population living today. But if you're speaking in French, are people that don't speak French going to listen to your show? Not likely. So your reach is limited to France, some people in Portugal, England, a few in the diaspora, some people in Louisiana, quite a few people in Quebec, and that's it. You've got a pretty limited reach. Now, you could say the same thing about film, television, etc. Films, television, radio shows, they would usually get translated and rebroadcast in other languages. Or there would be somebody recreating the show or movie or television or whatever in their native language, using their resources, whatever. Like when Phil Rosenthal did a Russian version of Everybody Loves Raymond, as an example. Alright, so, or the UK office versus the US office, you know what I'm saying? Alright, Shameless. Watch the US version. I'll never watch the British version, but it's okay, I like the US version. Anyways, I'm an American, goddammit. So, next we're at the point where, alright, you have the reach. Well, you do have tools, Google Translate, apps, specific apps, maybe, I don't know, Babbel, whatever, that can hear the audio or video in real time and translate it into your language, maybe on a slight delay, I don't know. But you could still enjoy content from anywhere in the world. Now, does that mean you're going to? Well, let's say Shin Lee lives in Bangladesh. And Shin Lee, I'm making up names, I'm trying not to be culturally insensitive, forgive me if I am. But let's just say Shin Lee, male or female, I don't care, whatever, non-binary, doesn't matter, is sitting in Bangladesh somewhere, doing their podcast on their laptop, and it's going out in whatever language they speak. I don't know what the native language of Bangladesh would be, but let's assume the native language. Or whatever language is predominant, we'll say. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know anything about Bangladesh. I couldn't find it on a map, I'm sorry. I'm an American, we're not good at geography. But now let's say Maria Taylor Smith in Montana, USA is looking for a podcast to listen to. Well, Maria is going to open up her app and she's going to say, I want podcasts about life blogs, whatever. The statistical odds that she'll come across Shin Lee's podcast, listen to it, get it translated into her native language, become a subscriber and enjoy it and be a regular supporter of it and consumer of that media are so statistically insignificant, you might as well say it ain't gonna happen. That's damn near impossible. Now, every podcast that's on the stream, whether it's Spotify or Apple or whatever, does have an RSS and people can subscribe directly to it. But here's the thing. The search algorithm is not going to just show it to you, even if you search specific titles with using parentheses and booleans and everything else to get it to search for the specific channel or host or whatever. It's not going to show up in your feed. The algorithm, in its, quote, infinite wisdom, air quotes, is going to feed you content, podcasts, YouTube, etc., that it has already observed and that it believes people will respond to. Because the algorithm's going to be like, hey, you listen to the, Hoopla show. Maybe you want to listen to the Bingle Bob show. They're very similar. Well, you listen to Hoopla because you like the host. Bingle Bob, same topic, but you're like, the host is a dork, I don't like them. Alright, so, you tell the algorithm that, and they never recommend you Bingle Bob again. Alright. Same thing with YouTube and TikTok, etc., etc. The algorithm rules all. Same thing with Etsy and Google and artists that are publishing on whatever. Social media, Instagram for photographers. So, let's go back in time again. 10,000 years ago, you wrote a book. How are you going to get it to people? Well, if you don't make copies, you got to go around and loan it to people one at a time. Very, very statistically insignificant, negligible, almost non-existent audience. Let's fast forward. You got the printing press. You get 1,000 copies of your book printed. However you come up with the money, I don't care. It doesn't matter. You got to pay somebody to distribute it to the libraries or schools or, the market, the bookstores, whatever. Okay, well, you printed 1,000 copies. They're out there. 1,000 people will read it. Maybe they'll share it amongst their friends. If it shows up in a library, you get a good bump. Theoretically, again, okay, you're in a library. Now it's, 1750 something. We'll go with 17 because I know the printing press already existed by then. 1758. You go into your local Yorkshire library, and there's 100,000 books spread across, 3 stories in a basement. What are the odds that just walking around randomly picking out books that you're going to pull out the Joseph Smith, Anna Maria, whatever book that I mentioned way back at the start of this video? Well, not likely. So even though your book is in a library, doesn't guarantee people are going to read it. Just because it's in a bookstore doesn't mean people are going to buy it. Same thing with if you put it on Amazon Kindle Publishing. You put it out there, it's out there. But if nobody buys it, nobody reads it, does it exist? This goes back to the tree falls in the woods, nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, we could argue all day. Without getting into the religious or philosophical or physics, science, ethical, etc. discussions on the nature of reality. We want to stay out of that for this video. We'll maybe get there someday. I'm not an expert at all in that topic, but again, I took a philosophy class in college, read a few books outside of college, seen some documentaries and videos, so I'm more versed on philosophy than just like Joe Schmo at the bar, but, not college professor or high school philosophy teacher level. Okay? But we'll talk about that in another day. But here we go. Same thing today. You wrote a book. You put it on Kindle. Well, is the algorithm going to show your book to people? Who knows? That's a roll of the dice. Same thing if you write a blog. Who's going to see it? Well, only the people that stumble upon it or the people you share it with on social media. So, yeah, you still have the algorithm if you know how to manipulate it. You could use social media, Instagram, Facebook, the one we don't say, Blue Sky, Mastodon, whatever, etc. And then, if you have a sizable following, people may or may not check it out. You're good to go. And then the algorithm will give you, incremental boosts every time somebody plays or views or watches or listens to whatever it is your thing is. But one last time, let's go back to in the old days when there was no cultural significance of pop culture. There was no concept of pop culture. Books were floating out in the ether, right? But, again, we've already established nobody read them outside of a absolute handful of people. They probably weren't very well preserved. They have never officially ever probably been referenced. Maybe outside of some obscure college paper somewhere in an anthropology or history or literature class, maybe, or poetry or whatever the appropriate class would be. I promise there's a point. So now we have to go back to modern times. I apologize for flopping back and forth, but it's how I tell this kind of discussion. But now we're at the point where, all right, you put a blog post out there, and maybe the algorithms pick it up and people read it. But you stop paying for the web hosting, and the blog company shuts down your website and deletes your content. You didn't make a backup. Oops, it's gone. Did that, even if it was a well-written, well-received, heartfelt, meaningful article or blog or whatever, it disappeared. There's no proof that it ever happened or existed. It was consumed in people's short-term memory. They may have registered a single thought, whatever their brain's summary or most important aspect of the article was. They maybe logged it in their memory somewhere, and that's it. It's gone for eternity and can never be retrieved. Well, theoretically. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that, not getting into the computer science aspect of it all. But now we have, where did it go, right? Books, back in the day, where did they go? So we've already established no one's going to see your video or hear your podcast outside of a small local audience. Local, not necessarily to your physical space, but local to your topic that you're discussing within the pop cultural divided up subculture that they identify with. Gamers, comic book nerds, sci-fi geeks, horror fans, political junkies, etc., etc., etc. Alright. So, you're still at the mercy of the algorithm. You're also at the mercy of the servers, the cloud, making your own backup, which, again, even if you make a backup, that's not permanent. Even if you put it on something you think is permanent, like an optical disc, like you burn it to a CD, DVD, Blu-ray, or whatever, disc rot is still a thing. And we don't know how long these plastic discs are going to last. Because, you know what? We have no measure to compare. They exist. But come on up here, buddy. Trying to find somewhere to put the mouse. Alright, so they exist, but, they're not perfect either, right? Even if you make multiple backups, you got it backed up on zip disks and SD cards and flash drives and compacts and, SSDs and HDDs. Alright, so you got like 35 backups. There's still no guarantee that it's going to be accessible in 30 years. Maybe there's no working, functional technology at that time that can access any of those antiquated medias. We don't know what's going to exist in 30 years. Just look at what existed 30 years ago. A 1.4 megabyte floppy disk and a 700 megabyte CD. That's it. Hard drives, we don't even really need to talk about hard drives. 30 years ago, hard drives were so insignificant in space that they might as well not even exist. Flash cards, memory cards, SD cards, those hadn't been invented yet. Or they were just becoming a thing. But unless you break through the algorithm and reach a mass audience on YouTube or podcast or TikTok or whatever, James Rolfe, Doug Walker, the Pauls, Mr. Beast, yeah, they broke through and now they have entered the cultural lexicon. But has this cheapened or lessened the significance of arts and literature? Art, literature, novels, film, television, podcast, radio, etc. It's all infinitely more accessible, easily to create, easy to distribute, relatively inexpensive or negligible cost to get started, bare bones. So we have way more books being written today, photographs being taken, television shows being broadcast, written, produced, created, more radio broadcasts and podcasts, and YouTube and TikTok and everything else than we ever have at any point in human history. But still, only a statistically insignificant proportion of that content, or art and literature, enters the broader pop cultural lexicon. Everybody on the planet Earth has heard the word PewDiePie and most likely knows it's a YouTuber, and that's it. That's all they know. They know there's a YouTuber called PewDiePie. They don't know what a PewDiePie is or does, who they are. They don't know anything. They just know that's a name that they've heard, and they know that they're famous. Mr. Beast, Logan Paul, Good Mythical Morning, etc., etc. Well, Angry Video Game Nerd, Nostalgia Critic. If you don't watch those channels, you don't know anything about them, but you've heard their name in passing referenced by other YouTubers or news broadcasts or, Entertainment Tonight or whatever. So you're at least marginally aware of it. Does anybody quote the Angry Video Game Nerd? I mean, anytime you scream ass, you could argue you're quoting the Video Game Nerd. But, I mean, that's such a common word. That's not really a quote, now is it? Now, I'm using Angry Nerd because he was one of the earliest YouTube sensations, and he and his channel and his colleagues absolutely shaped what YouTube would become, and have, I would argue, entered the cultural, pop culture, lexicon, zeitgeist, etc., etc. They're well known, not just their content, but the homages, the copycats, everything else. The Irate Gamer, for example. Pat the NES Punk, for example. So, yeah, they definitely impact culture and influenced culture, and that would continue to be cyclical, so we'll just say, yeah, there's the chance that any video could go viral at any given time and make that specific creator, famous, or at least their channel well known, get a lot of subscribers overnight, and then go searching for additional content, and you have to be like, well, it'll get here when it gets here. But We have this thing called the subscribe, right? Back in the day, you paid money to the newspaper or magazine, and that was a subscription, and it would come to you. Later on, you would still pay for the subscription, but you wouldn't get a physical thing. You'd just get something in digital. Or a website. Nah, you do what you gotta fucking do. I agree with that. I won't go near it. But, alright. I just had I fell asleep for a brief second, micro nap, and I saw a giant spider, so I apologize. That was a reaction to that. Not whatever I was saying before that happened. I'm bipolar, so I'm very familiar with micro naps. But, alright. Yeah, I've been awake for about 72 hours, by the way. I mean, I've had a couple of brief naps, 30, 40 minutes, but it's not important. Alright, so, you can enter the zeitgeist, but there's no guarantee that you will. But, just because a movie was made in 1937 and shown on 3,000 screens across the U.S., and viewed by hundreds of thousands of people and made millions of dollars, doesn't mean it entered the cultural lexicon. If nobody remembers it today, it might as well not exist or have never happened. Same with the plays that were performed 10,000 years ago in Rome. In our reality, modern times, they don't exist because they're so far in the past that we can't guarantee or prove that they did take place. It could all be fake. Everything we know could all be fiction. We can't prove any of it. This video is almost 90 minutes long, and I said it would be over an hour, so here comes the T-bone. At the end of the day, I would argue, and I'm going to rubber stamp this, I would argue that this, what I do, vlogs, maybe Good Mythical Morning, Angry Video Game Nerd, Technology Connections, a few other channels, I can't think of their names right off the top of my head. Cathode Ray Dude. That's just your random everyday vlogger that is doing a service, presenting topics or history or perspectives or philosophy or religion or science or whatever. I would argue these people, myself included, although I'm just lumping me in there, not necessarily puffing myself up, their work is more culturally significant in the long run to their respective audience than the polished, professional, fabricated corporate bullshit that the mass media, Hollywood, or the radio broadcasters, the film and music industry produce, put out, etc. You go to your local bar every Saturday night to listen to a band that only plays at that bar every Saturday night. That band is more meaningful to you than anything Green Day ever put out, even if you love Green Day. I don't, but hey, who cares? It's complicated, my relationship with Green Day. I will probably do a video on it, but I gotta be careful because, it's complicated. But here we go. Alright. But, if it's not preserved, let's say an EMP explodes and all of YouTube servers go down, or a solar flare, or a nuclear holocaust, or an earthquake, or a zombie apocalypse, or whatever, well, again, if there's no backups, then there's no proof that it ever happened. There's no way to access it. Now, the reason why I say, even though it's fleeting and will not exist forever, just like those diaries from 10,000 years ago that have been lost to time, even though it's fleeting and won't last forever, and probably won't reach a large audience, Technology Connections has, a few 100,000 viewers. Angry Nerd has, 2-3 million subscribers. I have less than 1,000, so there you go. Please subscribe. Please. Share everywhere. If 25 people subscribe to this video, new people subscribed, after watching this video and shared it to all their social medias, I could probably get to 1,000 subscribers pretty quick, and then I can start making money. Yay! Alright, but that's not necessarily a problem, but, would help me out a lot. Here we go. At the end of the day, the small audience that is going to be impacted by that fleeting content in that specific moment in time. As we know, people don't re-listen to podcasts or re-watch videos of YouTube that they've already seen outside of like music videos or instructional videos like redstone guides on YouTube on how to do things in Minecraft, etc. But for the most part, once you've seen a video, a vlog, a console wars, or whatever, that's it. It's done. You watched it. You moved on. You don't go back and watch it again. I'm generalizing, but for the most part, that's how most people consume YouTube, TikTok, podcasts, etc. Television, no. If you like a show like Friends or Batman or The Cape or whatever, Lost. Who likes Lost? I don't know. But you rewatch it from time to time. So maybe there is something more significant, or at least culturally accessible, to the corporate mass media. Everybody knows Friends. Most people have seen Friends, or at least clips of it, or references of it, or heard lines taken out of context, or observed memes of it, or clips of it in YouTube videos, or remixes, or auto-tunes, or whatever. It's just understood. Everybody has a bare bone acknowledgement, if nothing else, that Friends did exist, was popular, and maybe a skeleton framework of the premise of the show. But it's a popular show, and it continues to grow in popularity, and people continue to pay money to have it on their services, or buy the DVD, or watch it on TBS, or whatever. So the answer to the question is, this is the T-bone. The answer is all of it. Cave paintings, the diaries from, Vietnamese farmers 10,000 years ago, the plays that Shakespeare wrote, but the plays that other people that were alive at Shakespeare's time or throughout history wrote that aren't Shakespeare. Every podcast that has ever come and gone, radio transmission that has ever come and gone, either shortwave, AM, FM, or whatever, every television clip or newscast or broadcast or show or tape or program, every documentary that's ever been existed, every book that's ever been published, blog, website, discussion forum, Reddit, everything that humans have created, whether it's art or literature, whether it's film or photography or entertainment, education, it doesn't matter. It is all culturally significant to whomever is impacted by it at that moment in time, and whoever studies it in the future. Because we're all special in our own way. We're all unique in our own way. Thank you to anyone that made it all the way to the end. Please give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, and then lava chicken emoji, you know what I mean, to let me know you made it all the way to the end. Please and thank you. Stay cool.